Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. In the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha lays out a framework of false views in order to establish the right view. He lays out 61 doctrines or views that were current at the time in India. For a long time, people thought this sutta, the matrix of views, was arbitrary, just to try and cover all bases. There was a book written a fair time ago now, 20, 30 years ago, by a Sri Lankan scholar, Jayanta Lekhi, where he identified many of these views with actual schools in India at the time. So it's not entirely an artificial construction, although it does make a matrix in the various views are grouped together in various categories of similarity. And there are, amongst these various views, there are two broad primary categories, and there's one smaller set that falls outside of that. The Buddha's teaching itself he defines as the middle path between the extreme views. The middle path is a term that comes up in different contexts. The first time the Buddha used it was in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, his actual first teaching. He begins by talking about his practice path as being the middle way between the extremes of hedonism and mortification, a path that seeks neither pleasure nor pain. He says he has rejected the low path of the village seeking sensual gratification, and he's also rejected the path of self-mortification that he had tried for 6 years, extreme fasting and various kind of bodily tortures as a way to release the spirit. He rejects these both and finds the middle way. But in terms of views, the middle way, the middle path, is identified specifically with the dependent origination as a middle path between extreme views. The two categories of extreme views are Uchedavada and Sasatavada. Uchedavada, the literal translation would be the cutting off view, or the cutting off teaching perhaps, and it refers to materialist view. It's called the cutting off view because, as the Buddha said, one who holds this view holds that at the end of life the being is cut off without remainder. The four elements return to their places and the consciousness ceases altogether. The other extreme view is the Sasatavada, is the eternalist view, which holds there is some eternal essence, a soul or a Atman or a Jiva that continues from lifetime to lifetime, and it's imperishable, unchangeable, and so forth. And there are variations of these views, but these are the broad categories. The Buddha's own teaching he identifies as the middle path, as the dependent origination, which takes its founding principle, its central axiom, on the idea of causality. Everything arises according to causes and conditions. There is no randomness, there is no arbitrariness in the unfolding of events. And this is very important, and this is stated in the short formula of the dependent origination: this arising, that arises; this ceasing, that ceases, which is a way of expressing this law of causality. In the materialist view, or the Chetawada, there is a denial of this principle in there's an ultimate randomness. Things are the way they are just because that's the way they are. Science can explain in detail how things work, but is not really have an answer. It doesn't even regard it as a valid question to ask why. Why are things the way they are? The Susattawada's eternalist view, in the end, has to fall back on, if not exactly randomness, it falls back on arbitrariness and the will of a creator. This is just because this is the last analysis is always first cause, is that's just the way God did it. You can't question the will of God. So, to take a specific example, human beings are born into the world with all kinds of differences, and there may be some individuals that are born with extraordinary gifts of intelligence or strength or beauty or what have you, and there's other beings born into the world with disabilities, physical or mental dysfunctions that originate at birth. In the materialist view, they can, at least in theory, they can explain in terms of physical causes, genetics and so on. Our science is getting close to being able to explicate this, pretty exactly. But it doesn't answer the really human question that people would ask is why me? Why was my child born with Down syndrome? And why is this? Why this one and not that one? It's not even a question that science would regard as meaningful or capable of being answered. Because in the end there's an arbitrariness. Now, you could say a genetic mutation arises because a cosmic particle hit the gene in the parents' gametes and caused the mutation. But this is again entirely a random act without any reason why. In the eternalist view, this becomes maybe perhaps even more problematic, because you have to ask, why did God do this? Either God is not all powerful as he's cracked up to be and he makes mistakes, or he's got a malicious streak. Why is there this kind of gross human suffering? The middle path doesn't look for randomness or for arbitrary will of an external being. It sees everything as connecting the cause of a chain of cause and effect, and requires the explanation of karma, action and result, and requires then, as a further corollary, requires that some of these causes are originating in previous lifetimes. so that for any individual, it's all part of a chain of cause and effect. There's nothing arbitrary or random involved. And this is the middle view, that avoids the two extremes. There's a Buddhist writer and translator, Maurice Walsh, who once came up with a very powerful image or metaphor for the middle view, middle way as a view. Said it's like a round island in the middle of a lake. And from either shore of the lake, if you look at the island, it looks like it's close to the far shore. And he says that in the world, the two extreme views, eternalism and annihilationism, are always competitors. This is from ancient India down to the present day. They're philosophical rivals and competitors. And they see each other as complete opposites. And if you're standing on the shore of materialism and you look at the Buddhist middle path, then it appears to be, well, that's not much different than all the other religions. It's just a mass of superstition and strange beliefs. And, there's very little difference between it and the other religions. You cross around to the other side of the lake and you stand on the eternalist shore and you look at Buddhist teaching and you say, well, that's nihilistic. There's not much difference between that and materialism. It doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in the soul. This is actually precisely the critique that the Catholic Church at one point came out with a document critiquing Buddhism, and they said that was the main thrust of their critique, was that it's basically a nihilism. It doesn't have the higher spiritual value of God. So the middle path of Buddhism is, in this sense, the philosophical sense, or the sense in terms of doctrine, it's also a very fine line. It's like a razor's edge that one can fall off either way. And in the history of Buddhism, you see very often individuals and schools will lean one way or the other towards annihilationism or eternalism, and finding that middle path is a very fine line to walk. It involves, as I said, the dependent origination. It also requires the idea of emptiness, voidness, not self, and the idea of karma and rebirth. And if ever I want to come up with a FAQ, list of frequently asked questions about Buddhism, the most common one that comes up is, how can you teach rebirth and also not self? Which seems to many people to be a contradiction, but in actuality they're both required for this middle path position. Without one or the other, you'll fall off into eternalism or materialism. There is rebirth, but there's nothing that is reborn. There is a cause and effect. It's like the echo coming across the canyon. If you shout your name out at a canyon and you hear the sound coming back, is that sound the same or different in your voice? And the answer given by Nagasena was neither the same nor different. Part of the difficulty in grasping this pair of concepts is an implicit assumption of a continuous substance carrying on within this life. That from moment to moment within this life, there is only cause and effect. There's consciousness arising to an object. At the moment of death, the only difference is that now the physical body is no longer functional, so the next consciousness to arise in this series will have to arise elsewhere, and it'll be conditioned by all its previous karma to arise in a suitable location, in a human womb, or in a Dewa world, or as a Peta, or what have you. It also doesn't make any sense to not have previous lifetimes if we accept the original premise of cause and effect. Is the first consciousness arising in a lifetime, in a new series, either arises out of nothing, a creation ex nihilo, which would only be possible in a scenario with an almighty creator God. You know, he can do what he wants. He can create something out of nothing. But there has to be, if that's not allowed, there has to be a cause and effect. There has to have been a previous moment of consciousness as one of the prerequisites for the current moment arising. In Western philosophy and modern thought, there's something that gets kicked around and has been for a few hundred years. It's called the mind-body problem. You know, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? And the materialist view is that the mind is somehow a phenomena arising out of the body. The materialists in past times, they said the only thing that exists is matter in motion. Now I think it will, that's a kind of outdated physics, but the current view of materialists would say that mind is some kind of phenomenon arising out of brain function, which in itself is a very modern view. The ancients had no, at least the ancient Indians certainly had no concept of the brain had anything to do with the mind. It's not a natural, it's not as natural and obvious as it may seem to us. We're so used to the idea. And I think also in very recent times, people have gotten enamored of their own technology, and the mind is often compared to a computer. This analogy of the mind as a computer, the brain as the hardware, the mind as the software, this falls apart on examination. If anything is to be a computational process, and it's in the last analysis, it has to be mechanical. It has to follow certain steps. We call this, an algorithm. And it has to be reducible to a set of processes. You have a computer program written in one language or another, which all breaks down in the end to manipulation of ones and zeros. There's something called the Turing machine, which is a thought experiment invented by Alan Turing, that anything that could be considered an algorithm can be written out as a series of commands in binary. But you can examine this in detail, but you're getting really into the weeds. But the point is that if the mind is a process caused by and running on the brain, then it would have to be capable of being reduced to an algorithm. And some mental processes you can perhaps do that, but consciousness, the simple fact of knowing, of being present, of having experience, is not in any sense algorithmic. There's no way you can explain that as a stepwise series. It just is. It's pristinely simple. There's just experience. There's just knowing. And it's kind of amusing, actually, to read some authors like Dennett or Penrose or others who start from a materialist position and try and wrestle with this problem of consciousness. And what it often comes down to for them is a kind of a magic trick. They think, if the algorithm gets complicated enough, then consciousness can suddenly emerge. I think they've got it, exactly upside down. It's not, consciousness isn't something arising out of complexity. It's not in any way complex. It's pristinely simple. It's just being present. And there's a gulf between being conscious and not being conscious. There's the essay written by Chalmers, What Does It Mean to Be a Bat? This is dealing with the problem of consciousness, and he's saying that a bat is an animal that has a completely different life experience than us, very different, navigates by echolocation and so on. It's very difficult for us to imagine what it would feel like to be a bat, but we recognize it as a meaningful question, that it must feel like something to be a bat. But if you were to say, what is it like to be a baseball bat? That makes no sense, right? That's a meaningless question. It doesn't feel like anything to be a baseball bat. So there's consciousness present in the bat, the animal bat. And it's something that's difficult to actually explain or grasp a hold of intellectually because it's so immediate and simple. It's present all the time for beings that are conscious. Another example would be the conscious experience of looking at someone's face. You look at your friend's face and you know who he or she is, and you have this experience. Nowadays they have computer software that can recognize faces. Right? You have a camera and it feeds into a computer, and there's a database of known criminals, and it scans the face, and if there's a match, there's a beep. But it doesn't experience anything. This whole network doesn't have this experience or knowing in that sense. The operator, the computer operator looking at the screen has the experience, but the machinery does not, even though the actual mechanical process is very analogous to what goes on with the human eye and brain process. There is something at the end of the line that's quite different, that's unique for sentient beings. I've thought that, it's kind of an idea of my own, is that if we have to use a technological metaphor for mind-brain relation, a computer is the wrong one. We should consider a radio receiver. That the brain acts as a kind of a interface for mind. The mind exists independently of the brain or the body, but it obviously affects the body. Like we can move the limbs by willpower and so on. And the brain is sort of the organizing factor for that. I've also thought of a metaphor, or a parable, you might say. Let's say there was a some kind of primitive tribe living on an island out in the Pacific or somewhere remote, and there's a shipwreck, and the only thing that washes ashore is a crate with a radio in it, transistor radio, and they take the radio out and play with it, and all of a sudden there's this music comes out of it, and they're all surprised and amazed, and the wise men of the village trying to just figure out how this thing works, and they say it must be a little tiny orchestra inside the box. It's the only thing that could explain it. And then maybe later they even get, a little bit more curious, and they try taking it apart, and they see there's no little orchestra in there, but they discover that if they poke and pry at the different connections and turn the dials inside, they can change the sound. So they think the box is somehow producing the sound. The sound is made within the box. And it's very unlikely to occur to any of them that the sound is actually being made somewhere very far away, and all the box is doing is receiving the sound and transmitting it. In the Buddhist Abhidhamma, the idea of mind is that it's non-physical, and in the dependent origination there's a cause and effect relationship between body and mind, but you can't reduce one entirely to the other. They each have their own reality. One thing that's useful to contemplate, to try and get some understanding of this, is what it might feel like to be not a bat, but a formless being. In the Buddhist cosmology, there is one realm of beings that are classified as four khandha beings, in that they have the mental aggregates only and not the body. They have consciousness, perception, mental formations, and feeling, but they have no physical body whatsoever. It's difficult for us to imagine because our whole experience is anchored in a body. And our sense perceptions arise through physical organs, and our physical state of being influences our mind states so much. It's quite a mental exercise to abstract mind out of that. But there are those beings that have no bodies, they're pure mind. And one of the aspects of this is that they don't have a location. This is something difficult to grasp, but space is a physical construct. The body has a location. It has an XY axis, XYZ axis, so you can locate it in space. The mind is not like that. Mind is non-local. Space has no meaning to the mind. And for those beings that are not anchored to a body, you can't say they're here or there. You can't say they're anywhere or everywhere, nowhere. None of this makes sense, because space is itself a phenomena of the rupa khandha, the material aggregate. In the questions of King Milinda asked Nagasena, what's the fastest thing in the world? And Nagasena says, thought. And he says, how do you explain that? And he says, well, we're sitting here in Gandhara, Imagine yourself, have you ever been to Benares? He says, yes, I visited Benares. Well, can you imagine Benares in your mind? Yes. Well, you instantaneously traverse the distance to Benares, whereas your physical body, it would take you, a few weeks on horseback to get to Benares. And the Buddha said in the Dhammapada, the very first verse of the Dhammapada is, mind is the chief, mind is the forerunner. The body follows the mind like the cart follows the ox. And this has always been the idea, or the explicated later writers in Buddhism, that the idea that the body is essentially inert and the mind is the thing that moves, that causes the body to function. And in the dependent origination, the first few stages is because of ignorance, karma formations, because of karma formations, consciousness, because of consciousness, name and form. Name and form is the articulated organism. Consciousness arises first. The spark of consciousness allows the organism to come into being. There are some useful or thought-provoking analogs to that in modern thinking. There is this one maverick or rebel biologist, Rupert Sheldrake, that I highly recommend looking into, who started his career as a embryologist, studying how embryos unfold, studying like chicken eggs and lizard embryos and whatnot, and seeing how they develop. And he became convinced there was something missing from the standard explanation, that the morphogenesis, that is the origination of form, cannot be explained properly just by the DNA code. The DNA code, we understand now in great detail, is essentially a cookbook for proteins. It has instructions, coded instructions for production of protein strings. And then the first thing that happens when a string of protein leaves the DNA is it twists itself into a three-dimensional shape. We call that protein folding. And almost every time it does it correctly, even though it's a nearly infinite number of ways to go wrong, to fold itself into a complex three-dimensional shape. If it goes wrong, then we have a problem. We have, maybe a start of a cancer or some other, mutagenic issue. But obviously, most of the time, the billions and billions and billions of times it happens in the human life, it happens correctly. And no one really knows how it does that. And then as the embryo unfolds at higher levels of organization, it's also mysterious. Like every cell has the same DNA, but how does the cell know whether it's going to be a liver cell or a brain cell or a skin cell or what have you, and then arrange themselves into the proper forms and functions. Very complex, the different number of organ types and shapes, and they're all in the right place. How does that happen? And he suggested a theory that there has to be another source of information besides DNA. And he came up with his theory is what he calls morphogenetic fields. And this is where the more materialistically minded scientists go tilt and write them off, because he says these fields exist non-locally. They're not located in space. They're pure information fields. Does that sound, familiar? Information existing outside of space. And they interrelate back and forth with the physical forms. And this is one way evolution happens, that the life cycle of the forms, the actual animals, can influence over time, can influence the information in the field, and then the field changes the form in the next generation. So he doesn't make I haven't seen him at least make the connection explicitly, but this sounds very much like mind and karma, pure information existing outside of space, but having an influence on physical form in this plane of reality. Another intriguing consideration with mind-body or mind-physicality interfaces, the idea in quantum mechanics of collapse of the wave function. This is something very alien to 19th century physics, where the universe existed quite independently of any conscious observer. But in the quantum mechanical view, you can't extract the observer from the reality. It's part of the scene. Reality exists essentially as a great emptiness, of a probability wave, as a great potentiality. This is like the full emptiness of sunyata. There's a universal potential in emptiness. It means because it's empty, it means it could be anything. Right? It's a universal potentiality. But in quantum mechanics, this exists as a probability wave, meaning that some events are much more probable to arise than others. Some are more improbable. But they only become a definite reality when they're observed, when consciousness is applied to them. Then the wave function collapses, and you lose all the other possibilities, and just one event arises. And this is interface of mind and matter. So it's an aspect of mind relating to creating matter, creating a definiteness of matter. Right? So in Buddhist thought, throughout the history of Buddhist thought, there have been various nuances and versions of understanding mind and matter. And there have been schools, the Yogacara school, which postulate that only mind exists, that matter is an illusion, it's just a mental construct. As far as I know, there's never been a school on the opposite end that's been a Buddhist school that's been purely mechanistic and materialist until perhaps modern times, and you get some radical secular Buddhists now that are trying to base it on a materialist view. This is what I said about trying to maintain the razor edge, and that there's always the temptation to slide off into one kind of view or another extreme view. Maintaining that absolute middle path is very difficult. It's a very fine tightrope walk. But you can't really evade it either if you want to have any understanding. I'm going to return back to the very beginning of this talk. I mentioned that there, in the Brahmajala Sutta, there are two main categories of views, and there's a third one that's kind of outside. And that third one of wrong views is the eel wriggler's view, and there's a few variations of that. And this eel wriggler's view is what we would call in modern parlance, we might call agnosticism. Eel wriggler, or they're called eel wrigglers, that's a literal translation from the Pali, because they wriggle like eels. And the description of them is obviously intended to be humorous. It says if you ask them a question like, is the being reborn or not? If you ask them some specific question, they'll say, well, I won't say it's so, and I won't say it's not, and I can't say it's neither, and I can't say it's both. And it goes on, just like it gets more and more gibberishy. And the idea is that they won't, they can't or won't make a definite statement. And the Buddha attributes this view to either, he says that this view is based either on cowardice or stupidity. So he didn't really have too much sympathy or support for that agnostic position. So, just to kind of conclude and summarize, the main point I'm trying to make here is that the Buddha's view is the middle path between eternalism and materialism, and that in forming our thoughts and understanding about Buddha's teachings, we should always be striving to avoid sliding off into one of those extremes and seek the middle path based on dependent arising, based on cause and effect.
Damayam Damakataya Sadi Kalam Saramase.
Sadi, 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 Namo